The prestige of the Masters has made the club's green blazer the most coveted adornment in golf. So much so that a modern golf fan has difficulty imagining that neither the club nor the tournament was a foreordained success. Founded at the beginning of the Great Depression, the club faced financial ruin repeatedly during its first 15 years. As the club was being formed in 1931, the first business plan called for 1,800 members, each of whom would pay dues of $60 a year. 3 years later, as the Masters got underway, the club was 1,724 members short of that goal. So note, just 76 members in 3 years of trying to get the initial membership of Augusta National to join the club. The Masters, which began in 1934 as the Augusta National Invitation Tournament, it wasn't called the Masters for a few years in its early days. It was recognized from the start as an exceptionally well-run event. Time magazine that year described it as a, quote, new golfing institution and a new competition, rivaling even the U.S. Open in importance, far surpassing it in atmosphere. But it remained an economic burden for years. The club couldn't afford to pay the first winner, Horton Smith, or any of the other top finishers until 17 members chipped in the purse. The winner in 1946, Herman Kaiser, had to be told that his plaque would be along shortly, just as soon as the club could come up with the silver. That's an excerpt from the book I'm going to talk to you about today called The Making of the Masters. Clifford Roberts, Augusta National, and Golf's Most Prestigious Tournament, written by David Owen. This book was great. I've read a handful of books on the Masters, and although they're enjoyable, none of them go as deep as this book by David Owen does. He had access to Augusta National Golf Club's archives. He even had access to Clifford Roberts' mother's personal diary, in which he really got a story on his youth and how he grew up, something that is very, very difficult to find. Clifford Roberts is a guy who kind of is an enigma. He's somebody who, frankly, I didn't have any idea existed before doing research for this podcast episode. Despite the fact that I've been a big golf fan for a long, long time, I've watched the Masters for well over 30 years. It's my favorite sporting event to watch, and I have no idea, or at least I had no idea, who Clifford Roberts was. But he is the one guy who is most responsible for what Augusta National Golf Club has become and what the Masters Tournament has become and how it still operates today, nearly 50 years after his death. The purpose of this podcast is to study sports history's greatest people, places, and events, and learn from superior performers and personalities. There's perhaps no better subject to do that with than Augusta National Golf Club, the Masters Tournament, and the co-founder of each, Clifford Roberts. Before we get into his backstory and the subject of this book and the lessons that we'll be able to take away from it, and specifically how Clifford Roberts ran the club, I want to get into a few of the big takeaways that I had. I just thought were incredibly fascinating. Again, coming from somebody who I didn't even know existed. The other co-founder of the club, who we'll talk a little bit about in this podcast, is Bobby Jones. I certainly knew of him as a golf fan and as a sports fan, as a fan of Augusta National. Bobby Jones was an icon and a legendary golfer in the 20s and even beyond that, and still is thought of as a mythical figure. In fact, he is the only golfer to ever have won the Grand Slam, which is all four majors in a single calendar year. When he did it in the 1920s, those majors, unlike today, were the U.S. Open, the U.S. Amateur, the British Open, and the British Amateur. Today, it is the Masters Tournament, it is the U.S. Open, it is the PGA Championship, and it is the British Open. But nonetheless, Bobby Jones was a mythical figure. In fact, I think he had 2 ticker tape parades in New York City down Broadway just for him for winning the major tournaments in the 20s. So the other half of this, though, of course, the founder of Augusta National Golf Club and the Masters, on the other side of the coin to Bobby Jones, is Clifford Roberts. And we need to I think, understand maybe a little bit more about him before we take a deeper dive into his backstory and how he manifested Augusta National and the Masters tournament into what it is today. One of the quotes that I loved from the book came from another amazing golfer, a legendary figure in the game, Byron Nelson, who won 2 green jackets himself, or 2 Masters tournaments himself, I should say. And Byron Nelson says from the book, of all the executives I have known, Cliff was the best. He listened, and he would take what people said and turn it over in his mind and decide whether or not it was a good idea. Then he would follow through and find the right people to get the job done. Herbert Warren Wind, who was a prolific and very popular sports writer at the time, once called Roberts, quote, a relentless perfectionist with one of the best minds for management and significant detail since Salmon P. Chase. Today, Clifford Roberts, as I mentioned, not many people know about him. And I think, in fact, the only relic that mentions or bears his name at Augusta National Golf Club today, despite the massive impact he had on the club and the tournament, is a plaque inside the clubhouse, just off of Magnolia Lane, of course, in Augusta, Georgia, at Augusta National Golf Club. I do also believe there's a portrait of Clifford Roberts in the trophy room at Augusta National, but that is it. In many ways, his story is lost to history. But for those that are aware of Clifford Roberts, I love this passage from the book as David described, that he is known today mainly as the villain in a handful of classic press tent anecdotes, as a tyrant who ejected a player from the Masters for a trivial infraction, sent members bills for course improvements they had been rash enough to suggest, withdrew the memberships of men who had dared to cross him, and administered nervous breakdowns to a succession of executives at CBS, which began broadcasting the tournament on television in 1956. Most of the classic stories about Roberts contain at least a kernel of truth. He could be hard to work with, especially from anyone who wasn't used to dealing with a determined man who said exactly what he thought. But none of the stories begin to do him justice, and that's why this book is so important. Highly encourage you, if you're interested in the Masters, you're interested in golf or sports, or following personalities or figures who have changed the history of sports and professional sporting events, I highly encourage you to read this book, because I believe it's the only one that really gets into the detail of who this individual was, given the access that David Owen had to uncover what motivated him. As a side note, I purchased Clifford Roberts' own book about Augusta National and the Masters tournament called The Story of the Augusta National Golf Club, and thought I would do the first episode of this podcast on that book. At first glance, I thought, what better source material could I possibly have than the co-founder himself of the club and of the tournament writing his own book. As I read the book, and it does have interesting anecdotes throughout, but it's kind of a dry read, and it's more of Roberts just recounting the folks who were instrumental in building the club with him, kind of telling the chronological history of the club itself and how it became what it is, today, or at least up until and through the mid 1970s. But it doesn't really get into the psychology of what motivated him. And David, I think, does an even better job than Clifford himself in that. And why Clifford chose not to kind of dive deep into his own motivations is anyone's guess, or his own ways of working is anyone's guess. But I found that, again, The Making of the Masters book by David Owen is really the best source material I've found on the tournament. The other quote that I just absolutely loved that came from this book that I think really gets to the essence of who Clifford Roberts was and how he operated, and that is, quote, everything about Augusta National Golf Club and the Masters had to be the best. And if it was not the best, then it would have to be improved every year until it was. That struck me because it feels like Clifford Roberts is still the chairman of the Masters tournament. It still feels that way when you watch the Masters tournament every year. There's a little bit that has improved from the year prior, even though it is the gold standard in professional sporting events, and it's the gold standard in broadcasting professional sporting events. But they always improve iteratively, methodically, year after year. And the compounding nature of that has yielded an event that is not surpassed by anything even the Super Bowl, in my opinion, and how it's broadcast and how it is conducted. The Masters is unique in and of itself as almost a picture of perfection. But it seems like Roberts' philosophy certainly still drives the ethos of the Augusta National Golf Club today in the Masters tournament, that they're always looking for things to improve. They find those things, are very critical of themselves, and then they improve it each and every year. Another fun anecdote that I found from the book stated that pictures at the club are still hung on two hooks because crooked pictures drove Clifford to distraction. The golf shop still makes change with brand new currency because he couldn't stand dirty bills. I'm not sure if this is still the case in 2026, although it very well might be. I don't know. I think this quote that I just read was taken from later in Clifford's life in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I believe. It still could be the case, and I would certainly believe it if it were, that couldn't stand the sight of crumpled bills or dirty bills, that everything has to be crisp and clean. That level of detail isn't found really anywhere else, and it's because of Clifford Roberts and his ability to manage and see things that others couldn't. Mr. Roberts was told once what a great tournament it was, and I'm sure he was told this every year when they ran the tournament, but he said, "Thank you, but we really never get it right." And we still feel that way. I think Clifford offered this quote later in his life when the Masters was what it's really kind of become in the modern day, of an exceptional, almost perfect event. But he never felt that way. He was, again, always looking for ways to improve it for the fan experience, the competitors, those watching at home via TV. And another one for you. Loblolly pine on the golf course died. He wanted to know why it had died, and he wanted the tree removed immediately in case the thing that killed it was catching. So if there was a disease or something that could get into another tree adjacent to it, he wanted to make sure that was not something that could possibly happen. He didn't like deciduous trees because, in his view, fallen leaves were a species of litter. In his view, fallen leaves were a species of litter. That is an interesting, to say the least, way of describing beautiful deciduous trees, in my opinion. And when I see leaves in my backyard or in the fall, anywhere I'm at, I think they're often pretty. Clifford Roberts on the golf course at Augusta National Golf Club thought they were litter. That should give you a really good insight into how this individual wanted to make a perfect environment for his tournament and his club. But we must understand how the Masters and Augusta National have become the gold standard, like I said before, and how to host and produce a professional sporting event. To do that, we've got to understand Clifford's life story, who he was, what drove him, what motivated him. And again, after all, it's really Clifford Roberts who is largely responsible for Augusta National, the Masters, and the way the club and tournament operate today, nearly 50 years after his death. In the book, it states that, quote, "The Masters is still the competition by which other competitions are judged. That's a remarkable achievement, and the credit for it belongs largely to Roberts." So let's get into his backstory. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? What's he about? Not many people know, but this book does an amazing job of getting to it and shares lessons that I think all of us can take from this book and apply to our own lives. Born in 1894, Clifford, like most kids in that era, experienced a difficult childhood. From the book, he knew all about hardship, having grown up in a dozen small towns in Iowa, Kansas, California, and Texas. His life was hard, but he met it squarely. His life was indeed hard. In the book, it describes how often, as it just summarized, how often he moved, how often he had to kind of father his siblings because his dad was what I think would probably be described today as a serial entrepreneur. But as David, I think, so rightly describes, his dad's ability to be in business and be an entrepreneur is really more of a compulsion than a serial entrepreneur as we would define one today. And that's because every time they were on the precipice of success, if he had an asset that was doing well, whether it be a farm or whether it be a dry goods store or whatever business he was in, as soon as they maybe realized a little bit of success, Clifford's dad would sell the business and then they would uproot the family and move. And in that time, in the early 1900s, as you can imagine, it's difficult to move now in 2026, but it's never been easier to do that today. over 100 years ago, it was incredibly difficult to do that. His mother, Rebecca, bore the brunt of these decisions. She did the absolute best that she could, but she was often a victim of the constant moving, the constant being in flux. Clifford and his siblings often made friends, but they didn't have friends that lasted for long. He had to constantly make new ones in the places that they settled. There were good days, of course, as the book describes. Rebecca certainly had some good days. And again, David had access to Rebecca's diary, I think from a descendant of the family, allowed him access to the diary of Rebecca herself that really allowed David to get into, again, how Clifford grew up and what shaped his thinking and shaped him as a man coming out of a very difficult childhood in the early 1900s. But she did her best, Rebecca, that is. And there were good times, but mostly tiring and trying times. Unfortunately, in the mid 19 teens, she committed suicide when Clifford was 19. So, yet to realize his 20th birthday, just across his 18th birthday into his 19th year, his mother committed suicide and left notes for each of her kids. And those notes are recited in the book, and they are absolutely haunting. I can only imagine what Clifford Roberts had to deal with during that time and how that shaped his own life, what that meant for what his next steps were, and how he grew up. Of course, he had to grow up fast, and he, as I mentioned before, had to kind of be a father figure to some of his siblings. His dad was very preoccupied with other interests in the business world, and as soon as he would have any kind of success, they would uproot the family and move. But Clifford did figure it out. He kind of had his own way about things. He knew he was going to make something of himself. He was a very determined individual. And then in his early 20s, he landed a job in Kansas City with a men's clothing company. And he was a salesperson, essentially. And he was selling suits throughout the Midwest, in Kansas and Missouri and Iowa and Oklahoma and Arkansas. But although he was very good at sales, he was a fine salesman and having a decent amount of success, he was really enamored with this idea of going to New York and getting into finance. And as he did this, from the book, it states that he studied the biographies of wealthy men, hoping to learn the secrets of their success with the same unblinking focus that would later characterize his planning for the Masters tournament. He studied the life he wanted to lead and then set out to lead it. This is the first inclination we get, or first clue we get within the book of what Clifford Roberts is all about. He had an idea of what he wanted, and he was an incredibly focused and determined individual. And throughout his life, he didn't divert from that focus and the ideal vision that he set out for himself. He knew he was going to get it, and he was going to do everything possible he could to make sure that it turned out the way he wanted it to turn out. So no detail was too insignificant for him to focus on to get what he wanted. This is a big lesson, one of the big lessons, from the book that showed itself throughout Clifford's life and his tenure as chairman of the Masters tournament, which was a 40-year plus tenure. He eventually did move to New York. He studied the biographies, which I think is an interesting point here, of the men that he wanted to kind of be and what he aspired to be. And he uprooted himself from a relatively successful sales job with the clothing company that he was working for in the Midwest and moved to New York City. He wanted to be in finance, wanted to call himself a stockbroker. I mean, he was only there for about a year, and World War I broke out, and he was called to serve. This is actually the first time that Clifford was exposed to Augusta, Georgia. In fact, he was stationed at a base in Augusta, Georgia, and he was shipped over to France. He didn't stay there all that long, I think maybe just a year, but he did serve in the war. And upon coming back from World War I, he went back to New York, tried to make his way in finance, split some time with a company there and in Chicago, and eventually landed on his feet with a company by the name of Reynolds and Company, which was an investment bank. So he had started to really, again, he had a vision for what he wanted to do. He charted the course for how he was going to do it, despite the interruptions of not knowing anyone on the East Coast, not knowing anyone in New York City, and the interruption of going to war. He stayed with it and figured it out, and eventually got a job as a stockbroker with Reynolds and Company. And so his next step was to realize the social life that he also wanted himself, aside from the professional life. So Roberts joined a country club in Westchester County. I believe it was Knollwood Country Club. He made a lot of connections there, of course. He did that thoroughly and probably with some calculation, but also with some genuine friendships that he made throughout his tenure in New York City and his membership at the club. He was a prolific bridge player, and he met a lot of folks not only on the golf course where he worked on his golf game, but also playing bridge and other social activities at the club. This is where he first met Bobby Jones, the other co-founder of Augusta National, as I mentioned before. He was, again, a massive star in this era, an icon of American sports, kind of the golden child. So he got connected with Bobby Jones. Roberts and Jones quickly became fast friends. They had a lot in common, although, again, Roberts wasn't anywhere close to the golfer that Bobby Jones was, but they, I think, had an ambition among both of them, an idea that they wanted to do big things, as Bobby Jones had already done, but Clifford really wanted to do. And at one point, Bobby Jones confided to Clifford Roberts that he wanted to build a golf course. He wanted to build something, particularly in the South, where Bobby Jones was from. He was originally from Atlanta, Georgia. He wanted to build a golf course that reflected his ideals of the game and how the game should be played. Jones, in those years, often spoke of his desire to build a championship course in the South. So one day in 1930, Roberts suggested building the course in Augusta, where both men coincidentally had played winter golf while staying at the Bon Air Vanderbilt Hotel, which was run by a mutual friend. I'll pause here for a second. That mutual friend was a guy by the name of Walton Marshall, who ran the Vanderbilt Hotel in New York City, as well as a handful of other Vanderbilt hotel chains, one of which being the Bon Air Vanderbilt Hotel in Augusta, Georgia. Back to the book. Roberts, after his stint in the Army, had returned to Augusta for occasional golf vacations. He liked the city in part because it was warm in the winter, yet far enough north to be easily reachable by overnight train from New York. Jones liked Augusta's mild winter climate and believed that a club there might afford him some privacy, a scarcity at home in Atlanta. They had a handshake agreement and they agreed to proceed. I think the interesting thing here is that it undersells in the book, although not necessarily in the book, but in that quote, it undersells the motivation I think that Bobby Jones had to build a club to get away from all of the spectators who wanted to see him play golf. It was a fact that even if Bobby Jones wanted to have a casual round on, say, a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon at any given course anywhere in the United States, eventually word would get out and he would be followed by hundreds, if not thousands, of people by the time he got to the back nine, for example. So he wanted a place where he could actually play and not be watched, a place where he could have his friends and connect. There was no thought of ever building a course and having a Masters tournament there. There was the idea, of course, of building a course in Bobby's reflection of the game that he loved and building a championship level course, but there was no idea that it would turn into a course where today a major golf tournament is held every year, and it's the only course in which a major is played at the same place every year. The U.S. Open, the PGA Championship, and the British Open rotate courses every year. The Masters at Augusta National Golf Club is the only place where a major is played at the same spot every year. So that was never necessarily a thought. I think the privacy that Jones sought was really the biggest motivating factor, or at least up there with the idea of building something that he could put his stamp on as, this is my idea of how to play the game to the best of course design and the best of a amateur and pros ability. So they decided on Augusta. Now they needed to figure out where to put this golf course. Where would the land be to put this golf course? Augusta Country Club already existed. And in fact, they found land adjacent to Augusta Country Club, not too far out of the central business district of downtown Augusta. But at that point, it was very rural, a very rural area. They found the place that today is Augusta National Golf Club. One of the quotes from the book, I think, really hits on why this piece of land that Augusta National Golf Club sits on was the perfect and almost preordained spot for what has now become perhaps arguably the greatest golf course in the world. And it comes from this passage in the book, quote, "It seemed that this land had been lying here for years, just waiting for someone to lay a golf course upon it. Indeed, it even looked as though it were already a golf course. And I am sure that one standing today, where I stood on this first visit, on the terrace overlooking the practice putting green, sees the property almost exactly as I saw it then." That was a quote from Bobby Jones, again, the co-founder, along with Clifford, of Augusta National Golf Club, who had made that reference later in his life. And one can imagine, I've never set foot on Augusta National. I hope to one day. But I've seen it, of course, quite a few times from all the angles of the TV cameras over 30 years. And I can only imagine that if you step onto the property outside of the clubhouse and the 18th green is to your left and the big oak tree is to your right that is adjacent to the first tee box, that if you look out beyond the course, you could probably envision that it looks very similar to how it looked when Bobby Jones found this piece of land and knew exactly that this was the right spot for his hallmark golf course, which again has turned out to be arguably the greatest course in the world. From the book, the building that now serves as the clubhouse was built in 1854 as the home of Dennis Redmond, who had bought the plantation a year before. So Redmond was, in addition to a planter, an architectural historian and an editor of an agricultural, publication called the Southern Cultivator. His house had 18-inch thick walls made of concrete, the material that before that time had not been used in residential construction in the South. Redmond called it artificial rock. In 1858, he gave up on indigo and sold his property and house to a Belgian horticulturalist named Prosper Berkmans, who turned the plantation into Fruitland Nurseries. Quick side note here, some of you may recognize the name Prosper Berkmans. That's probably because it's the namesake for Augusta's new and relatively new, been around now I think for a few years at least, ultra-exclusive hospitality experience that is offered to patrons during Masters Week. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it is adjacent to the second hole on the left-hand side within some trees that are off of the left. And you can see some pictures of it if you search it online. I'll leave a link to it on the show notes so you can easily access it and see what it's all about. I believe it takes at least $10,000 to get in the door there. I also think it has its own unique memorabilia shop that is not part of the really unique in and of itself memorabilia shop that the general public, not the general public, but the patrons who go to the Masters each year are able to access at the Masters. So it is as high class and top notch of a hospitality experience as you can find anywhere in sports. And it's named after Prosper Berkmans. It's called Berkman's Place. Back to the book. The Fruitland Nurseries that Prosper Berkmans started after he purchased the plantation from Dennis Redmond, the indigo plantation. It is said to have been the first commercial nursery in the South. In the company's 1861 catalog, Prosper reported that his test gardens contained more than 1,300 varieties of pears, 900 varieties of apples, 300 varieties of grapes, and 100 varieties of azaleas, a plant that Berkmans was largely responsible for making popular in this country. Had no idea of this fact, too. And so most of the flowering plants that bloom at Augusta National during Masters Week are descended from the Fruitland Nurseries stock. And I don't know about you, but when I see Amen Corner in April from now on, I'm going to think of Prosper Berkmans. I'm going to think of Fruitland Nurseries and going to think of the cool anecdote that is that Prosper Berkmans, a Belgian horticulturalist, brought azaleas to the United States for the first time generally and planted them on that nursery, and they still exist in some form and some lineage today. And if you haven't seen the broadcast of the Masters, and particularly Amen Corner, where holes 11, 12, and the tee box on 13 sit, it is a stunning and beautiful sight. So I encourage you, if you haven't done that, take note of that, and you will see the beauty that existed before even a golf course was there. But again, it was kind of preordained that this golf course must be on this property. So they decided to get into this land. In fact, I think Prosper Berkmans died in the early 1900s. The Fruitland Nurseries was given to or assumed by his wife in the 1900s, and the business struggled. And I think in 1918, it was eventually sold to a Miami businessman, a Miami investor, who also at the time thought that he wanted to put a golf course there, but it didn't work out. Good thing for Bobby Jones and good thing for Clifford Roberts. It did not work out. And they purchased, along with 5 other underwriters, Bobby Jones and Clifford Roberts purchased this land and began to set up a golf course and started to plan for what would become Augusta National Golf Club. They started the membership drive in 1931. And as I mentioned at the outset of this podcast, and it's really hard to believe, it was an insane struggle to try to get members. They had a goal of 1,800 members to sign up. And in the late 20s, when they had this idea of building a golf course together, that must have been, I think, probably a relatively easy goal to think about attaining. And the reason is because Bobby Jones was such an icon. He was from Atlanta, which is only about 2 hours away from Augusta. By that time, Clifford Roberts had good connections in New York and the financial capital of the world. They were going to make this a national golf club, given Bobby's connections and given Clifford's connections. They set an ambitious goal, and they fell way short of it. Most people, I think, when seeing the return on their efforts, again, over 3 years and having fewer than 100 members sign up, just 66 in a year, would have thrown in the towel. Of course, there were insinuating factors here. Burying the lead. In the early 1930s, the Great Depression broke out, and no one knew how bad it would be. Clifford got rocked in the Great Depression, as did everyone. And there's often been quotes attributed to Bobby Jones and Clifford especially, saying that if he had any idea, and this is certainly hindsight, but if he had any idea how long the Depression would last, he certainly wouldn't have gotten into this venture. It nearly broke him. But it didn't really get much better even after the Depression started to wane. From the book, the failure of the membership drive, as grim as it was, greatly simplified planning for the club. This is a really important point from the book. Forget about a clubhouse. Forget about tennis courts. Forget about a second 18. Month by month, Roberts pared back his conception of Augusta National until little remained of Jones' course. So they had ideas to build what is a traditional country club with pools and tennis courts, and that makes a lot of sense. But as a byproduct of being in the Great Depression and being incredibly financially strapped, not being able to get dues-paying members to join the club, given the climate, they pared everything back until only the essential remained. It's such an important point that they had to work within these massive constraints. And today, and after the Great Depression ended, after World War II ended, the club, with all of that focus, with all of the energy, and none of the focus or none of the extra energy going to tennis courts or swimming pools or any of the other things that come with a country club like this one, the golf course was a beacon of almost perfection even at that time. So working within these boundaries and working within constraints actually allowed them to make a product that was perhaps better than they ever could have imagined. Part of the reason why the club was, and the golf course itself was and is, as good as it is today, and one of the most renowned clubs, and has been ever since it was opened in 1932, is because of the designer of the club, Dr. Alister McKenzie. So Clifford Roberts is probably, if I had to sum this up, most responsible for the operation of the club and the traditions and the operation of the Masters tournament. Bobby Jones, certainly heavily involved in all of those things and is kind of the hero of the club, the legend that is still mentioned so much during the broadcast and in Butler Cabin when they present the winner of the green jacket after the final putt on Sunday at Augusta. Bobby Jones's portrait hangs right above the mantle in Butler Cabin. He is kind of the mythical figure of the club and the hero, the chief salesman, if you will, of the club, and always has been. But there's this third figure, Alister McKenzie, Dr. Alister McKenzie, a medical doctor, Scottish descent from Britain, who is often looked back upon today as perhaps the best course designer who ever lived. He's got many courses across the United States that he's designed, maybe not many, but a handful, that are unique in so many ways, and unique in a way that really lends credence to the fact that his philosophy in building golf courses was all about the land that the golf course sits on and not moving a whole lot of dirt and just using, frankly, the topography that he's given, the landscape that he's given to shape a golf course into nature. It's interesting because Dr. Alistair Mackenzie was also a serviceman in World War One. He served in the British Army and I think had a tour in Africa and elsewhere during World War One, and he became a specialist in camouflage, in applying camouflage techniques to the British Army in a number of different ways. So he used that knowledge and he used his training in that specific area to also apply it to golf course design. And what that means is he simply has disguised hazards and bunkers and into the nature, into the natural topography of the golf courses that he designed, whether it be Augusta National Golf Club or Pasatiempo Club in California or Cypress Point on the Monterey Peninsula in California near Pebble Beach. Bobby Jones was playing an amateur event at Pebble Beach in 1929 and on a Mackenzie designed course, and he knew at that time that if he were ever to build a course, Mackenzie would be the guy that would do it. He would take no one else. So Mackenzie knew how to do this perhaps better than anyone else, had an intuitive sense and a very unique, different approach to designing golf courses than really anyone else. And it stemmed from this idea of using the nature as it is and not manufacturing routing or golf holes out of something that didn't exist. And he loved to put hazards and disguise them in ways that made it seem like they were always there. And even though, of course, a sand trap wasn't at the Fruitland Nurseries, for example, in a specific place, but he made it look as if it was once you had the routing of the course done. And he also disguised mounds really, really well and camouflaged those. He plays with players' depth perception. And so you may think that a hazard, a mound, or a sand trap, a bunker, is further away than it really is, and vice versa. So there are so many cool ways that he was able to manipulate golf course design, and he agreed to do this project for Bobby Jones. Of course, again, being who he was, you really couldn't turn Bobby Jones down at that time if he asked you to be a part of something. Alistair Mackenzie was a very significant figure in the development of the club. He did this course design. He started in 1931 or so. The course came together rather quickly because, again, budgets were constrained. Work was done rather quickly. People were looking for work. They weren't paid very much, but they got it done quickly. Sadly, Alistair Mackenzie passed away in 1932 and never got to see the course finished. But he did recognize and know that what he was working with was probably the masterpiece of anything that he has ever done, even though he never saw it to completion. So things in the early 30s were not going so well. There were so many ways that, in so many instances in this era, where Clifford Roberts and Bobby Jones thought they may just have to cease operations. Roberts wrote that, quote, "I have devoted all of my time to the interests of the club during the past 2 years. But after the close of this season, I do not see how I shall be able to continue to do so. I have just been checking over my personal records, and I find that in addition to the cash that I have advanced the club, I have, since I started to work on this proposition, used up personal funds to the extent of nearly $30,000. Again, at the time, in early $9,000 was a great sum of money. Back to the book. The time has now arrived when I will need to busy myself with the task of replenishing my own bank account." And a bit more on the club's financial troubles in this time. This is, I find, incredibly fascinating. It's very difficult to even imagine the club, even during a depression and even during its genesis in the early 30s, as being in such dire straits. But from the book, by late March of 1933, a full listing of the club's debts filled 2.5 single-spaced typewritten pages, and Roberts was forced to prepare a grim letter to the creditors. "The Augusta National is embarrassed," he wrote, "by current debts amounting to approximately $31,000. It goes on. This was, it should be noted, a form letter. The club's situation was so precarious that even small bills had long gone unpaid. As an example of this, the club owed $5.85 to Augusta Grocery Company for toilet paper and $1.37 Stump and Walter Company for hose nozzles. Read that again. The club owed $5.85 to a grocery company for toilet paper and a buck 37 to Stump and Walter Company for hose nozzles. They couldn't even pay the most minuscule of expenses. They had no money. They were out. Debts were climbing. They thought there was no way out of this, and they hadn't even really gotten this club off the ground. In December of that year of 1933, the book goes on to say, Clifford found $2 on the floor, and the sum was duly entered on the credit side of the club's ledger. Just an incredible commentary that even at this time, and it makes sense, you can excuse it during the Great Depression, of course, but still, knowing what the club is today and how exclusive it is and how difficult it is to get a pass, and by the way, for those of you listening who have turned your name into the lottery year after year and continue to get rejected, we must stand strong. One day we may get to be at the greatest golf tournament on the planet. But there is no issue, of course, with getting folks to go and buy Masters tickets or finding and inviting members to become a part of Augusta National Golf Club. But at one point, despite being in the midst of a depression, there was absolutely a very difficult era for this idea, this vision that Clifford Roberts and Bobby Jones had, and they barely made it. But they did. They were determined. This is where Clifford's determination is shown again. Despite coming close to throwing in the towel, he did not. Neither did Bobby Jones. They figured it out. They kept creditors at bay, and they continued on. One of the things that they tried to do, and they had a dogged pursuit of this, is getting people that were in the upper crust of American society to come and play Augusta National Golf Club. One of those individuals, and obviously the idea behind that was to try to get them to become members. It was very difficult, of course, to parlay a visit from any one of these individuals into a membership. Some were successful, most were not. But one of the individuals that played the club early in 1934, or actually I think it was in 1933, was Prescott Bush, and that is George H.W. Bush's, President George H.W. Bush's father and the grandfather to George W. Bush. At the time in 1933, Prescott Bush was the chair of the U.S. Golf Association, and they were looking for a place to host the 1934 U.S. Open. So Bobby Jones and Clifford Roberts wined and dined to the best of their abilities that they could. Prescott Bush, he came and played Augusta National Golf Club. Of course he was impressed. Anybody would be impressed playing this course. And they put on a full court press to try to get the U.S. Open to come there in 1934. But ultimately, their bid was rejected. I think there were certainly issues with playing the U.S. Open in the summer in the South and the sweltering heat. Again, the Masters today is played in early April. It is the perfect time to play that tournament in that climate, in that specific spot in the United States. So they could not get the U.S. Open to come there in 1934. They needed and they desperately wanted some sort of recognition beyond what they could conjure up with their friends and contacts. They needed some widespread recognition to try to keep this club afloat, to try to get folks to become interested in the club and then hopefully become members. They were really determined to get this done, but they couldn't get the U.S. Open. So the heck with that, right? They decided we're going to start our own tournament. People would recognize and come and play just because Bobby Jones was a part of it at this point when they had this idea. By the way, they didn't know or think if Bobby Jones would actually play in the tournament, but they were persuaded to do this and eventually persuaded Bobby Jones himself to be part of the field, which made a big, big difference to actually getting players to come. So if Bobby Jones did not play, likely the Masters never gets off the ground. But a popular sports writer at the time, Grantland Rice, which, by the way, is the namesake of Bill Simmons' former ESPN website, he was, Grantland, that is, like others of his era, a very popular and dynamic sports writer and had a large following in the early 1900s and the 1920s through the 1930s. And he was kind of the ringleader of promoting this event. He helped persuade Bobby Jones to play, and they decided to go ahead and do it. And it was interesting. It wasn't called the Masters from the jump. It was only officially called the Masters starting in 1939 through, of course, its present day. It feels like a name that has always been there, but it wasn't. Bobby Jones actually didn't like the name at all. Again, Bobby Jones is probably the most mild-mannered person you could think of that era. He was a gentleman, as they would say in that time. And he thought that the Masters, which was Clifford Roberts' idea, by the way, to call it that, he thought that name, the Masters, was immodest. It's too pretentious, he thought. So he decided, hey, let's call it the Augusta National Invitation Tournament. And it was called that from 1934 through 1938. Despite that fact, Clifford Roberts really loved that name, the Masters, and even when it was officially called the Augusta National Invitation Tournament, he would speak with Grantland Rice and others in the press and say, hey, this is really the Masters tournament. So it was kind of referred to the Masters in um, print publications at the time, kind of going back and forth between the two names, and eventually Bobby Jones relented. It was only, though, marginally successful. It's important to note that the guests that came to the first handful of Masters in the 30s had an exceptional time. As I mentioned at the outset of the podcast, that Time magazine called it an exceptional event in every way. Clifford was dialed into every detail that could possibly be attended to, and made it an exceptional experience. But it didn't make a whole lot of money. Although they did see some promise, though, in the event. It was only marginally successful. But again, during the time of the Great Depression, you'll take marginally successful. I think Clifford at the time, and Bobby probably also, saw that it was really their only hope. And there were a few things that also conspired to give them this idea, despite it not being a smash hit at the box office, if you will, in 1935. And one of those ways was a really dramatic tournament played in its second year in 1935. A golfer by the name of Gene Sarazen, who went on to win that year's Masters in 35, made a double eagle on hole 15, a par 5. And it was described then, and still is described today, as the shot heard round the world. So it got a lot of publicity. They thought that the Masters was secured into perpetuity after that specific event in 1935. That shot is still legendary today. And in fact, the bridge that goes over a small pond on hole 15 is named after Gene Sarazen. So it was a landmark event, or a landmark moment in the history of this club. And they thought, Roberts did, and Bobby Jones did, they thought that it was really going to secure the event forever. From the book, though, despite the marginal financial results, Roberts was now convinced that the Masters held the key to the club's success or failure. And that was an important point. He had to have something that buoyed him, allowed him to try to continue to recruit members and placate the current members, to let them know that, hey, this is something that we're going to stick with. Of course, this is something that has showed a little bit of promise, and we want to keep this club going. And that's despite the fact that the field size, the players who came and played the event, dwindled every year when they started it, up until 1939, where they only realized a slight bump. So in 1935, they saw a decrease from the inaugural event in 1934, fewer contestants or participants still in 1936, and then in 1937 it dropped again. In 1938 it bottomed out, and just a slight bump in 1939. But as he planned for the third Masters, the club's financial condition must have increased his conviction that the tournament was essential. What other hope was there? The tournament had given the club a national reputation, thanks in part to Gene Sarazen, and it was the only significant variable in the equation. Nothing else was working. Many years later, Roberts said that the hospitality for which the Masters is legendary had been the product of necessity. To sell enough tickets to cover costs, the club had to pamper spectators. The price had to be low, the food had to be good, the views had to be unobstructed, the course had to be perfect, the bathrooms had to be clean. Roberts built the Masters in the same way successful entrepreneurs have always built businesses, by focusing on the needs of his customers. This is probably the biggest lesson of the book, and it ties into the lesson that we talked a little bit about before, in that dealing with constraints. When they were building the club, if you'll remember, they had this grand vision for tennis courts and swimming pools so that membership could enjoy it, but financial conditions necessitated that they could not do any of that. That the only thing they could possibly focus on was the club, or the golf course itself. They had to narrow their focus. And again, the hospitality, not just the course itself, but Roberts intuitively knew and executed and followed through on. He knew that the way to make this event, the Masters, successful was to pamper everybody who came there and be attentive to every need that they have. They still adhere to Roberts's creed of iterative improvement. Massive lesson here, focusing on the needs of his customers. So long as everybody's business does that in the right way and never loses sight of it, that's a pretty good North Star to have for a successful recipe, despite very challenging and difficult circumstances. The book goes on to state Robert's obsession with detail helped create an extraordinarily agreeable experience for the small group of people who, in those years, encountered the tournament firsthand, whether as spectators, competitors, or correspondents. Robert's perfectionism was deeply rooted in his character. Virtually all of the major events of his life, the traumatic moves, the debts, a fire that he tragically and unknowingly started at his house when he was a boy that burned his house down, his family's house down, the suicide of his mother, the Great Depression, the financial crisis, the crash, had taught him that success is ephemeral, that happiness and security can evaporate at any moment, and that good things happen only through unremitting effort and imperviousness to repeated failure. Again, huge lesson here to take from the book. It bears repeating. Good things only happen through unremitting effort and imperviousness to repeated failure. That is a hallmark of any entrepreneur who is building anything. There will be challenges, there will be failures, and you have to just, in many ways, recognize them, but at the same time ignore them and push through. There will be repeated failure, but it takes unremitting effort. It has to be greater than the repeated failures that you experience to build something of significance that lasts. Clifford Roberts was the right guy at the right time to build Augusta National Golf Club and the Masters into what it is today. So they get through 1939. Things still aren't all that great. And then World War II is on the doorstep of this era, and trying to understand at this time what the Masters or what Augusta National Golf Club could become or would become was a very difficult thing. The last Masters held before it shut down for a couple of years in the midst of World War II was held in 1942. From the book, the celebration following the 1942 tournament was muted, however. Roberts and Jones now realized that the club was going to have to shut down for the duration, and a number of members assumed that it would never open again. But here again, there's an opportunity that is present in the face of adversity, and this is really interesting. This is a part of the Augusta National history that I had no idea about, and is really hard to envision, just like all of the other things that are hard to envision about this club in the 30s when it started to get going. From the book, in 1942, Bobby Jones suggested to Roberts that the club might both contribute to the war effort and improve its financial situation at the same time by raising cattle. By raising cattle on the golf course during the period when the club was shut down. Roberts went ahead with the idea, hey, what do you have to lose, right? And suggested that the club might also want to try raising turkeys, geese, and fish. So essentially turning this into a livestock farm. Augusta National Country Club as a livestock farm. Wonder what Alistair McKenzie would have thought during this time. In the end, though, only cattle and turkeys were tried. I don't believe the cattle operation was successful. I think it operated at a slight loss. Hey, worth trying, though, when you have nothing else left to try. But the raising turkeys actually did net a bit of a profit for the club. So it probably all shook out even at the end of the day. But it is difficult for me to imagine cattle roaming the 18th fairway, for example, or the back nine. But that was true in the early 1940s. But they eventually decided to open the course back up in 1944, December 23rd to be exact. And it's interesting, much of the work from the book states that much of the restoration work on the course was done during a 6-month period by 42 German prisoners of war who were being detained at Camp Gordon in Augusta and were available for hire as day laborers by local businesses. So German soldiers who, interestingly enough, when they were brought to the United States, as mentioned in the book, I thought this was fascinating. They saw New York and they were flabbergasted by the idea that New York was still there. They thought it had been leveled as part of the war. That was part of the propaganda that the German army fed their soldiers during that time. But they went to New York and they eventually made their way down to Augusta, Georgia at Camp Gordon. And the club had made the decision. It was a difficult decision. It was not preordained that the club would open back up after World War II. That could have been it. Again, the previous decade before that was obviously very, very trying. And it was in some ways on its last legs. But they made the decision to open back up, and they had prisoners of war, 42 of them, German soldiers who were largely responsible for getting the course back into shape after turkeys and after cattle had roamed the place for 2 years. And it's a good thing they did, because after the war, of course, in 1945 and then the ensuing years, the United States started to boom. The economy started to boom. Peace was realized. American enterprise really started to kick in high gear. Capital and money was more liquid then than it ever was before. It took almost 15, 16, 17 years for Clifford Roberts and Bobby Jones to get to this point, but they started to get some traction finally. They didn't have as hard a time getting members to Augusta National Golf Club. Interest picked up in the tournament. It was certainly a heady time for the club and became a really heady time personally for Clifford Roberts, because he became very close associates with who was at the time not yet president, but soon to be president, Dwight Eisenhower. And he met Clifford Roberts in 1948. They became very close friends. Dwight Eisenhower loved to play golf. He loved coming to Augusta National Golf Club to do that. I think he visited the club roughly 24 times or so at least, even with his wife and family during many extended stays throughout his presidency. But Clifford Roberts became a very close associate after the war with Dwight Eisenhower, and in fact became maybe not quite his right-hand man, but maybe so, one of his closest advisors in his presidential campaign and throughout his presidency. Clifford managed Dwight's personal finances at the time. He also set up the first blind trust in political history at the time, as President Eisenhower, or as Canada Eisenhower, I should say, prepared for the presidency. And so this was an era in which it must have seemed to Clifford that all of the work, all of the repeated failures, and all of the effort that he put into overcoming those almost debilitating challenges was worth it. This is probably Clifford Roberts' happiest time in his life, and that continued on into the 50s and in the 60s. So after the war, back to the book, Roberts began strategizing about the future of the Masters, and he really understood that to grow it, to grow the game of golf, that TV was going to be at the center of his desire to really cultivate interest in the tournament. He was intensely interested in the airing of the Masters tournament on TV, and this was in the even as early as 1945, when I think only 6,000 people in the United States had televisions, and the size of the screen was maybe the size of your hand. If obviously it was only in black and white, you could hardly make out anything. You could hardly see anything. It was a far cry, of course, from what TVs are today. But he had an innate kind of desire to make sure that he worked on this idea that the Masters could be televised, golf of all things, even in the mid 40s. From the book, Roberts was surely one of the few people at that time who were even thinking about the possibility of showing golf on TV. Fewer than 6,000 television sets were in use in the United States, and they had screens the size of a hand. Eventually, Roberts did get the Masters on TV in 1956. It first aired on CBS, which still carries the coverage today. He initially had an agreement with NBC when they broadcast the Masters on the radio, but given Roberts' operational style and high demands for quality, they couldn't come to an agreement, and CBS was the first carrier of the Masters on TV in 1956. And you can imagine that it was probably a pretty rough broadcast, which it was. And I love this piece from the book that described it. Quote, "The first Masters broadcast was even in the extreme, and it lasted just a total of 2.5 hours over 3 days. But it was a hit with golf fans. The number of viewers was estimated at 10 million, and Roberts later learned that in the grill rooms of golf clubs all over the country, groups of golfers had gathered to catch glimpses of the action and of the course that they had heard so much about. 4 days after the tournament, William McPhail, who was the director of sports at CBS at the time, wrote to Roberts, quote, "Our department has been literally flooded by letters from all parts of the country expressing appreciation that this tournament was brought to the nation. So many commented on the unbelievable beauty of the course," which is interesting since they could hardly see it, "the tremendous crowds in attendance, and the overall fine staging of the event." The success of the TV effort really was largely rested with Roberts and his idea that this was even possible at a date when TV was very new and broadcasting sports was very new, much less golf, which is a challenge in and of itself in a wide landscape outdoors. From the book, during the Masters that year in 1956, when it was first broadcast on television, Roberts had devoted virtually all of his time to the broadcast. He understood the opportunity here. This is a very important point. He understood the leverage that TV afforded the tournament. He had momentum post-war to kind of make Augusta National Golf Club and the Masters tournament what it eventually became in the modern era, and he knew TV was at the center of it. So, dedicated, as the book states, virtually all of his time to the broadcast and nothing else. He had been struck by the power of television during Eisenhower's presidential campaign. So he took from an adjacent experience the idea and saw the power of what TV was in presidential politics and knew that this has got to work for sports, and particularly my event at Augusta National. That was the first campaign, by the way, which TV played a significant role. So Roberts had a front row seat to all that, and he believed that the new medium had the potential to transform not only the Masters, but all of golf. And this is an important point underlying all of this in the book. When he was obsessed with TV and wanting to show the tournament on TV, it had nothing to do with money. When we think about TV and sports today, it has everything to do with money and what contract value is placed on an NFL package or a golf package or baseball or whatever the case might be. Everything has to do with money. It wasn't the case with Roberts. His whole idea about broadcasting the Masters on TV was making the experience better for folks who eventually might come to the course and see it. They could see it on TV, grow interest in the game itself. It had nothing to do with receipts for Augusta National, despite the fact that in the 40s and the 50s, when this was beginning, they certainly could have used as many financial resources as possible. And don't get me wrong, they got paid for the broadcast rights. However, that wasn't the chief consideration here. From the book, despite his eagerness to build the tournament's purse, Roberts' interest in television was not mercenary. In 1958, shortly after American Express had signed on as the program's first sponsor, Roberts warned Ralph Reed, the company's president and a member of the club, not to become carried away. The average golf fan takes his golf pretty seriously, Roberts wrote, adding that nothing but extreme annoyance could result from untimely, too long, or too frequent commercials. He believed that interruptions should be held to a minimum, and that if networks, tournament sponsors, players, or advertisers became greedy, they would do themselves and the game more harm than good. It's an incredible thing to say in that era, and honestly to say to the president of American Express and a member of the club at the time, again saying it's not about the money, that his focus, Roberts' focus on the customer, on who's consuming the content, was all that mattered to him. The money was secondary. His aversion to making money for money's sake via advertising suited Roberts well when he renewed these TV contracts with CBS, and he had a year-by-year contract with CBS at the time because he knew if they didn't do a good enough job or cease to his demands to make it better, he would just go somewhere else. He had the ultimate leverage, not because of money necessarily. It was because of the customer and wanting to make the product better. And because the product was so good, interest from all over the United States continued to accelerate. And he had all the leverage in negotiating contracts with CBS. The book describes this really well. and says, paradoxically, perhaps Roberts' focus on quality rather than money made him a feared negotiator at CBS. Such an interesting point. Goes on to state that he, Roberts, was willing to accept lower fees in exchange for commitments from CBS to improve the show. Again, that's the only thing that mattered to Roberts at the end of the day. He expected the network each year to outdo its previous efforts, and he spelled out exactly how he felt the broadcast could be improved. His approach to television was identical to his approach to the tournament. He believed that every year was a learning experience, and that no matter how good the current year's effort might have been, the next could always be better. To sum this up, another great quote in the book is this: Roberts was feared at CBS not because he made unreasonable demands, but because the currency of his deal making was not money. He wanted results, not fees. I'll say that again. Roberts was feared at CBS not because he made unreasonable demands, but because the currency of his deal making was not money. He wanted results, not fees. Mastered broadcast today, just like the course, just like the experience from media, from the patrons who go there, is still the gold standard. The broadcast itself is still the gold standard. Watch it this spring in April. I'm recording this in late January 2026, and I can't wait until April comes and the Masters begins again. And you will see on TV when you watch it that it is often stated and shared that the broadcast is brought to you with limited commercial interruptions. It's almost as if Clifford Roberts, 50 years after his death, is still the chairman of the club and still looks over every little bit of the operation, including the broadcast. There are so many fun anecdotes in the book. Again, I encourage you to read it to get the full flavor of them. But Roberts probably was described as a dictator, as you probably guessed from some of the things that we've already shared at the time when he was running the tournament. And one of those instances manifested itself in how he managed the broadcast and how he got into the minute details of the words that people used during the broadcast. In one instance, I think it was in 1971, maybe it was Jim McKay, who was the announcer at CBS at the time, got carried away perhaps on the broadcast and mentioned that during the tournament a mob was running because they were excited about what had happened at the tournament, and Roberts was beside himself at the language that he used. And he said, there are no mobs at Augusta National, and we do not run. You cannot run on the grounds, or you will be stopped and perhaps asked to leave. This is one of his rules, again, that is coming to the surface, that has stuck with the tournament for a long, long time. But he micromanaged every little detail about the tournament, including the words that the broadcasters used. You will also notice that the word fan, is never used during the tournament. Those who go and are actually on the grounds at Augusta National Golf Club are not fans, they are patrons. And the broadcast team will only refer to them as such. You will not hear them referred to as fans. Why? Because implies somebody is fanatic, and that is too radioactive for Clifford Roberts. It was at the time and still is today. It is a tradition, like so many others at Augusta National Golf Club, that is kept up even in the modern day. Even in 2026, coming up on almost 100 years of the course itself, that feels as if it's as recent as when Roberts laid down these rules in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and so on. So the Masters was really rolling at this time in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. TV had brought it to a whole new group of people that could see it and experience it for the first time. Color television finally brought the vividness of the course to life. Rivalries on the course, like Arnold Palmer versus Jack Nicklaus. Byron Nelson, I mentioned, he was a little earlier in the 30s and the 40s, but nonetheless, these individuals, these personalities came to the fore at the right time after the war that made the Masters become the event that it is today. And it wasn't just the competition and growing prestige of the tournament that improved during the time. The hospitality continued to improve too. Again, one of the overarching themes of this book is the iterative improvement of everything that Augusta takes on and everything that the Masters takes on. The hospitality improved during this time as well. And in no small part, his right hand man, Bowman Milligan at the time, Augusta's first ever employee, they worked to make sure that the patrons' needs were catered to every step of the way. And from the book, it shares this anecdote, quote, "The service was the guiding principle behind Roberts's perfectionism and his conception of almost every aspect of the club and tournament. His practice of calling ticket buyers patrons was a reflection of his belief that the purpose of the club during Masters Week was to serve the people whose support had made the tournament possible in the first place." So service, again, with the patrons, the guests, those who were on the property during the Masters, that was Roberts's obsession and his only focus. Fun note, I mentioned Bowman Milligan just a minute ago, and I also mentioned the book that I thought I was going to do this episode on that was written by Clifford Roberts himself, called The Story of the Augusta National Golf Club. I searched for that book and saw that a new copy was like $350 or something like that. And so then I saw a used copy, though, for only $34. Of course, I purchased the used copy, and I received the book, and I was ready to dive in. I opened the cover of the book, and inside the front cover is a note that states, "To my sister-in-law, Thelma, from Bowman Milligan," signed Bowman Milligan. Bowman Milligan was the first ever employee at Augusta National Country Club, hired by Clifford Roberts and Bobby Jones, and he is said to be the hardest worker, from Clifford's own words in his own book, that he ever knew of, and was one of President Eisenhower's caddies. And it was just a really cool anecdote, and I now own a bit of Masters history, despite the fact that that book doesn't give Clifford Roberts justice. It doesn't get into the things that David's book does that we are studying today and taking lessons from. But it is a really cool artifact that I now own, and is a neat piece of history. So it is I think, a good reason to not only buy books, you should look at used books too. You never know what you might find in the front cover or elsewhere. Throughout the 60s and the 70s, as the Masters was really starting to take root as a tournament and as an event, as it continued to grow, one of the challenging aspects of it was the health of Bobby Jones. And this is one of the saddest chapters, probably, of Clifford Roberts' life. It's one of the saddest chapters and portions of the book. But Bobby Jones, throughout his entire life, had a spinal issue that was perhaps diagnosed correctly, an operation that was done on him that was, at the time, the best that they possibly could do, but that ailed him throughout the later parts of his life and rendered him only able to see the course for a long, long time as he aged from a golf cart. He simply couldn't walk anymore, much less play golf. And in the mid 60s to late 60s, it became apparent that his health was failing. And it was a very trying time for all of the members at Augusta National and for the club itself. In the late 1960s, Bobby Jones was named chairman of the golf club itself into perpetuity, or excuse me, president of the golf club into perpetuity. There will never be another president of Augusta National Golf Club. That is Bobby Jones's seat forever. And Bobby Jones passed away in 1971 and had a massive effect on Clifford Roberts, his psyche, um, what he thought of his own future, and where the club was headed. During this time, in kind of the waning years of Clifford's life as well, in the 70s, there was a lawsuit that he was involved in when Northwestern Mutual at the time was sponsoring a LPGA event, and they wanted to use the name the Masters and call it the Ladies Masters. And at the time, again, the Masters event itself has grown in popularity. It was a big deal even 50, 60 years ago. So naturally, a lot of events wanted to, try to use that name and bring attention to their own events. And one such example was the Lady Masters. So there was a lawsuit filed against the LPGA to have them cease using that name. And throughout that process, it was a very trying and challenging thing for Clifford to go through, right on the heels of the death of Bobby Jones, 1971. And out of that process came perhaps the quote that epitomizes and summarizes this entire book and what Clifford Roberts meant and did for the Masters. And he said during this trial, "Building the Masters had required more than 40 years of pain, debt, good luck, hard work, focus, and obsession. Those are all hallmarks for building something of value that is great and that will stand the test of time. Any entrepreneur who's done anything or built anything, or anyone who's done something hard, understands that it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take some pain. It's going to take some luck. It has to take focus, and it has to be some sort of an obsession, which the Masters and the Augusta National Golf Club certainly was for Clifford Roberts. Again, building the Masters had required more than 40 years of pain, debt, good luck, hard work, focus, and obsession. That quote came from Clifford Roberts as he was trying to hold on to that Masters name and make sure that it wasn't just volleyed around to other organizations to use as they wish. Embedded in that name, those two words, the Masters, was all of what I just mentioned that came from Clifford Roberts's mouth during that trial. Shortly after that trial, again, it took a big toll on Clifford. He became increasingly frail. He had, unfortunately, terminal cancer at the time. He often saw the best doctors that he possibly could, not only at that time, but throughout his life. And he had a stroke in 1977 as well. He stepped down as chairman of the Masters in 1976, a tenure that lasted over 40 years. And he made his last trip to Augusta National after, I believe, seeing a doctor. And he needed help to walk. He couldn't walk on his own. He could barely stand on his own. So when he came back to Augusta National for the last time, he had someone help him go to the first tee. And so he wanted to make sure that a house that was once built beyond the first tee was demolished and could no longer be seen. And it had been demolished for a long time, but Clifford Roberts knew what was about to come, and he wanted to make sure that the house was no longer there. And so he saw that and asked to return to his cabin at the golf club, where, by the way, he lived for most of his life. And Augusta National Golf Club is really Clifford Roberts' only home for his entire life, or the tenure of his life. If you could label a home for Clifford, it was Augusta National. It was never any place that he grew up. He had an assistant at the club that night go out and get him a new pair of pajamas. And so he put them on. And then shortly after, in the middle of the night, he got the help of someone. To this day, we don't know who that is. I don't believe that's ever been discovered. And went down to where the par 3 course sits today, near a service road adjacent to the course, and took his own life with a pistol. The following day, the Augusta National staff, someone on the staff, found him. They found his medical records in his pajama pocket, and he found a note to his wife. This was a premeditated event that Clifford, like everything else that he did, wanted to manage down to the last detail. He didn't want to suffer. He didn't want to continue on in his ailments, and he took his own life in 1977. Upon his death, Jack Nicklaus said, "Mr. Roberts set the tone for tournament golf with his Masters. The standards and quality with which he conducted the Masters are unmatched anywhere. All of us in golf appreciate what he has done for the game, and he will be sadly missed." That's the first episode of the Pantheon podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. I'll see you next time.